Thank you. Right, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are today. Welcome to the latest drop-in session. I realise the title of this session is perhaps a little bit on the vague side, but I wanted to use it as an opportunity to just kind of explore UPN a little bit more. So I think for those of you who've used UPN before, I'm sure most of this will be quite familiar with you. Anyone? Sorry, could I ask everyone to go on mute? There's some fun voices that are going, but a little bit distracting. Thank you. Um, so yeah, those of you who've been on any training with us recently will also probably be familiar with some of the things I'm going to go through, but might go through some of it in a little bit more detail. So as you can see on the screen, we'll just touch a little bit on what UPN is, talk a little bit about UPN versus some other notations. Just have a look at how UPN is implemented in Spark. Again, if you're not super familiar with UPN, when I go through the other sections, we'll talk a little bit about the history of it as well. So you'll see it's a slightly different implementation we've used there. And then just a few tips and tricks on how to get started. So let me dive straight in. So what is UPN? Well, it's short for Universal Process Notation, and it is a approach to modeling processes which is designed to be very human centric, to be easy to use and understand. So it's really good at it's really good for communicating processes with people, because one of the things it doesn't use is lots of different shapes and symbols. It forces us to use natural language to describe the processes. So that has a couple of benefits. One is, from a reader's perspective, it should be pretty straightforward to follow a process, because you don't have to learn any different shapes or symbols or anything like that. You can literally just read the text. The other thing that I always say to people when they're kind of embarking on and starting to learn UPN at the beginning is that because it uses natural language, when you actually map the process, it forces you as the analyst or process mapper to really challenge the stakeholders and subject matter experts to clearly describe the process using natural language. Now, that sounds simpler probably than it actually is. So I'm sure many of you have experienced this often. Is actually what you're doing is you're really getting people to think much more deeply and be really, really clear about what the process is. One of the benefits of this approach is I liken it to sort of recycle and reuse, or create once and reuse, if you like, as I've put on here. And that is, if we use this approach to create a common language to describe a process, then we should be able to move away from the situation where you get lots of different teams documenting the same process but in different ways because they have different needs of that process. And secondly, you should be able to move away from that situation where people map a process every time they need it, because you've got something that is clear and easy to understand. Because often what will happen is you'll go back and look at a process and go, oh, that doesn't quite look like how we do it today, so I'm going to start again. And again, if you've got it mapped in UPN with this sort of clear natural language, it should be easier to keep up to date and keep live. Again, one of the things we commonly do with this is think about it in terms of the questions that you can ask as really good questions to help drive or structure when you're working with stakeholders. So the activity is what happens, the role is who does it, the systems are what you're using to perform the activity. The input or trigger is when the thing happens. So we do this thing when we've got this input. The output can sometimes be described as why. Why do we do it? What value is the activity adding? And then we can use things like the detailed view to describe how the thing actually happens, or you use the attachments to capture what else you might need to do the process. So I thought also I'd just cover a little bit of history with this, because again, as I said, this is something we cover in the training when we bring teams on board, but it's always worth sort of going over. So UPN is based on IDEF0, loosely based on IDEF0, which itself is a sort of derivative of something called SADT, or System Analysis and Design Technique. Now, these approaches go back to, or right back to the 1960s for SADT, but IDEF0 is really well known because it was developed for the US Air Force to help with modeling complex systems, especially around their manufacturing and jet aircraft space. So it's got quite a long history. One of the things that's really interesting about it is that it's this sort of systems based approach. So it was put together to sort of help deal with complexity. And one of the interesting things I learned when researching some of the background to these things is that traditional flowcharting approaches, so using the sort of symbols and swim lanes and so on, I'd always believed that had come from a manufacturing background, but actually digging into it, it originally came from construction, and it was all about kind of dividing the work up between the workers on a construction site, so you can make sure that everything gets done kind of efficiently and in the correct order, instead of builders kind of bumping into each other when building buildings and so on. And then it moved into manufacturing, and it worked really well where you're sort of following a widget through a production line, and it was used in early sort of programming, but it became difficult, and actually it's still so commonly used for this today. But when you sort of look at a process from a systems perspective, what you're doing is you're kind of mapping bits of a process that fit within a wider system. And that's really where the SADT and IDEF0 came about in the 60s, because it was like, actually, we're starting to build systems that are more complex, and we can't use traditional flowcharts to do it. And so that's why it kind of works really well today with the complex organizations that we work in. So UPN emerged in the 1990s, as I said, a sort of simplified derivative of IDEF0, and now it's really increasing in popularity at the moment. One, because it again, as I said, this sort of complex organizations that we work in nowadays, with the advent of cloud, the speed with which systems can change, it's really important to be able to manage that complexity. Salesforce.com, who are a pioneer of cloud technologies, they recommend it as an implementation for implementations and business analysis. Again, really good for that. And we're now, with the advent of generative AI and large language models, it actually lends itself really, really well to sort of training AI and AI agents, because of that natural language element to it. So again, you'll start to see various features coming up in Spark in the coming months, which really lean into this as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about the background of UPNs. Let's just touch a little bit. I've kind of talked about some of the other notations as well, but just to again sort of see how it's different. I'm using BPMN. I say and flowcharts here. Obviously, BPMN is a much more extended and detailed build on top of the traditional flowchart approach. Actually, what I really wanted to do is get a photograph of a stencil of some of the original flowcharting shapes, but I didn't have time to go and get one of them, but there's plenty online. But here's just a sort of selection of some of the different shapes and symbols, and it has its place and it can be quite valuable, but it does lean heavily on a visual syntax, which means that you have to learn it, which kind of makes it a bit more difficult and complicated. You can use it in a simple way as well, but remember, what it's doing is it is looking at kind of specific end-to-end processes, which are kind of sort of fragments, if you like, of a system, whereas UPN is much better at allowing us to map kind of low-level processes, but as part of a wider, integrated into a wider system. And another example I've got here is the event-driven process chain. So I'm not sure if anyone has come across that before. It used to be very popular with users of ARIS, system. I think that is now mainly dominated by BPMN, but it used to be the main kind of approach that they used to push for it. Just give you a sense of the sort of difference between them. So a little bit on how we implement UPN in Spark. As I said, it is probably slightly different if you go back and if you go and research UPN and the background to it. There will, I know I saw some names joining the call earlier who were involved in putting together the original specification and coming up with the name UPN, going back a number of years now. Must be nearly 20 odd years. I say it sort of emerged in the 90s, became quite widely used before it was kind of agreed as a sort of standard and specification. But basically how we implement it in Spark is we're using it to the user interface in Spark was originally designed as a workshop facilitation tool. So UPN lends itself really, really well for this kind of, the phrase we use, mapping a process at the speed of conversation, because of its simplicity. But we really wanted to sort of make it as easy as possible. So one of the things we did, as you can see in the example, and those of you who use Spark will know, is just really simply putting the questions into the boxes. So when you put the shapes onto the page in a collaborative environment, you'll see very quickly that the audience, the participants in a workshop, they very quickly learn it, and then they just start telling you as you put the boxes up onto the page, or they'll start shouting out, calling out what the different pieces of information are. Now, one of the things we found when we were doing this, we used to put why, the question why, in the output box, and again, those of you who've got experience, sometimes asking people why they do an activity can be a really hard question for many people to answer. Really, what we're trying to understand is, when you finish an activity, what do you have at the end of it? So it helps us understand the boundaries of that particular activity. Now, sometimes that might be the why, sometimes it could just be a thing that you've got at the end of it. And so what we did is we borrowed on the user story. Again, if you're familiar with agile development or agile planning and user stories, it's this idea of, as this person, I do something so that I've got something at the end of it, ideally some sort of outcome. And that's helped in many ways to sort of help people think about, as I said, what do they have at the end of the activity, rather than asking the question why. As I said, some people can find that difficult to answer. UPN, I'm not sure it's explicitly, but it does borrow on a number of lean principles as well, which again is really useful. So obviously, by focusing on the output of an activity, it helps you to really think about the value that activity delivers. So I'll often tell people on training sessions that when you're doing a workshop, the bit where you come to asking people about the outputs is your opportunity to really challenge them to think about the value that activity is actually delivering to the end customer, or to the organization. So it's another way of kind of thinking about what is how do I define some sort of outcome. And the other thing that I'll often say to people is, you don't have to have an output for every single activity. If you've defined an activity and nobody can think of a good output for it, there's a good chance you probably don't need the activity in the first place. So it's not always about forcing yourself to answer the question of the output, as much as challenging the activity to make sure it's the right activity and you're doing the right things to get a valuable output. I didn't put it on here, but one of the other kind of parts of the lean principles I like is the principle of flow. So it focuses on the flow of information. And again, those of you familiar with using UPN, you'll know that it is all about understanding how work or data flows through things, how they flow through the process, rather than how they flow through the roles that sit in the process. That's a sort of subset of that information that you collect. Just got a quick example here. I'm just going to show, actually it's two examples of the same process. So the first one here is using UPN, so defining inputs and activities, outputs and roles against those steps. But in this case here, we're using it perhaps more as a more traditional approach to how you do a process, in terms of just kind of laying the whole end-to-end process out in one kind of big long flow, which again, I don't, there's not a major problem with this. Again, if you've seen lots of our examples, you'll know they don't really work. We don't do it like this. We don't recommend doing it like this. But sometimes when you are doing the initial discovery, sometimes the process just kind of naturally unfolds on a page like this. Now, what we do in this case, again, you're perfectly welcome to keep the process looking like this, but generally what we do with UPN is a sort of hierarchical approach. So because it's systems based, it allows you to summarize processes at a very high level and then break those down into more detail. So this exact same process might actually look something a bit like this. So here what we've got is now just sort of 3 main boxes, but with the detailed view. And it's the same process underneath, but actually what we've done is just broken those sections down into these logical high level steps in the process. So just going back to that systems-based approach, if anyone's sort of you're familiar with systems approach and systems thinking and so on, that what it does is it's comfortable working in chaos. It's comfortable working in the area where we don't know exactly what's happening, or we don't know exactly what's happening yet, but we might go and investigate and find out. And generally what you can then do is you can treat a piece of a system like a black box, and we know that black box, we can feed some sort of input into it and we'll get some sort of output of it, and that can often be relatively predictable what's going to come in and out, but how the black box works inside is unknown. And so that's one of the benefits of doing this, is you can still describe, without knowing exactly how the process works, you can still describe the process at a given level. So you can still communicate that process within the organization. Then what you can do is you use the detailed views or drill downs, we call them detailed views in Spark, to break that step of the process down and then start to explore it in more detail. So as that's again, that quite nice ability that you don't have to capture the process in all its detail just to capture the process. You can do it at a high level and then go into the details as and when you need them. Another benefit of this is the ability to make the processes more readable on a computer screen. So I tend to use the phrase of like chunking the process up. But basically, if you think that nowadays, most of the time you're going to be reading a process on a computer screen, typically a laptop monitor on your desktop, if you're lucky to have one. And so if you think about, how do I present the process so that I'm not having to scroll around, I can see everything on one page at one time. This ability to break it or chunk it up like this gives you that ability to turn it into screen size pieces of process that you can break down. And final benefit of this ability to create these sort of hierarchical models goes back to the point where you're actually mapping or discovering the process with stakeholders. So if you take the approach, and again, this takes a little bit of practice, but if you take the approach of actually challenging the stakeholders when you're mapping the process to summarize the process right at the beginning. So rather than just allowing it in the previous example I showed there, where actually we just kind of capture all the details and we keep going until we've got the whole process captured. Actually, if you challenge the stakeholders to try and categorize or group the things they do into and summarize the process at a high level, it actually helps them understand the process and articulate it better, because you're basically forcing them to think more deeply about the process. So it's a really good exercise to go through. I realize that it takes a bit of practice with workshop facilitation to get good at it, but if you can master that, it's really valuable. If you're interested just on that one concept, there's a really good TED talk about this. So he's not using UPN, but it's a guy called Tom, his surname I've forgotten, But if you search for Draw Toast online, you'll find he's got a website. I think he's done a book, and there's a TED talk, and he talks exactly about this concept, how you can get people to help them understand their own work better by first sort of laying out a lot of steps and then trying to group them and categorize them in different ways. So it's a similar sort of thing. Cool. Okay, so that's a little bit about how we implement that in Spark, and I'm just going to finish off very quickly with getting started. So interestingly, because of this sort of ability to summarize processes at a very high level and break that down into the kind of nth degree of detail, it's not uncommon for people to find it actually quite difficult to think, where do I actually start with UPN? The answer is very simple. You can start anywhere. You can start right down in the details and build that hierarchy up, or you can start at the very top of an organization and break it down. If you start at the very top of an organization, it's going to probably take you quite a long time to break it down. So with kind of more traditional flow charting approaches, you're going to be used to working with a sort of very small kind of process fragment, if you like. Whereas this kind of this sort of opens things up a little bit and can make it a little bit harder for people to think where to start. But I advocate keeping it really simple. So just a few things that you can start with is, okay, what process is it that you actually need to map? And before I'd start drawing any boxes and lines on the page, be really, really clear, okay, what is the name of the process that you're going to map? What is the purpose of that process? Now, I have to confess, I don't always do this. Sometimes it's too easy not to do it. But there have been so many times over the years where I've been in a session where we've got stuck. We've been trying to map a process, and it's like the wheels are spinning and we're not making any progress. And then we pause and go, okay, what's the purpose of this process? And a short conversation and a 1 or 2 sentence purpose statement is more times than not will overcome that, because what will often happen is you will have a number of different activities or processes that are all sort of overlapping, and people will kind of have a slightly different view in their mind, or they'll be thinking about the process from a different perspective. And so, or might not be even clear themselves about why they do the process in the first place. Having that conversation about the purpose often just kind of unlocks it. So if you can do that before you start, it can save you that pain. And ideally think about identify what the scope of the process is. So what triggers it to start in the first place, and what are the final outputs or outcomes in the process, so that when you start mapping it, you've got a clear set of boundaries to work from. Really important is the next box on there is, okay, why do we need to map this process now? Because if you're clear about this, the reason that you need to map the process, it answers so many other questions that we get asked all the time. One of the most common questions I get asked, especially related to UPN, is how much detail do I need to map my process in? And that question, that can only be answered by knowing why you're mapping the process in the first place. What is the question that you're trying to answer by mapping the process? And therefore, once you've answered that question, you've answered how much detail you need to go to. You map to the level of detail till you've answered the question that you've asked. So that question could, I mean, it might be as simple as, we just need to document the processes so we've got a standard way of doing things. So then you have to think about, okay, well, what is sufficient amount of information to know that we're doing things in a standard way? But I'd say more often than not, that's almost like a secondary outcome of why most people we speak to today are mapping processes. It's because they're having to either perform some sort of analysis on a problem in the organization, or they are building towards some sort of change or transformation. So looking at trying to identify problems and then look at requirements and for a future state process. So again, be really, really clear about why you need to map that process. Then you go ahead and map it. I've just mentioned here something called the 5-step approach. I haven't outlined it in here, but if anyone wants to know more about it, I think we've done drop-ins on it before, and we will do again. But it's just a really, really nice, simple structure to use for running workshops. It just goes through, where do you start? Start with the title and the inputs and outputs. Map the activities, map the outputs, do the roles and systems, and then overlay any other information or questions that you need to do in there. As I say, if anyone wants to know more about that, then feel free to send me a message and I can share some more stuff on that in future. And then finally, share it. So, by getting started, you want to think about, why do I need to map that process? That will help you think about who's it for, who needs to be involved in the mapping, and who else will need to see it.